My name is Marcus Merrell. I'm the Senior Director of Technology Strategy, which means that I'm trying to help the company to put together the vision for the future of how we can connect different areas of test throughout the development lifecycle, and using my experience as a test architect for 20 years to try to tell the stories that our users are experiencing every single day. So hopefully that will come in handy to you. But today in particular, I want to talk about web and user analytics. And one thing I would love is to see kind of a show of hands, who here, assuming that everyone is sort of coming from the retail e-commerce space, who here is involved with user analytics and testing user analytics at your company? Is there you can click the little raise hand icon, and I'll see if I can actually see it. Kat, are there some hands raised?
Oh, yeah, I saw 3 hands raised.
All right, cool. So 3 out of about 50, that's a little bit what I expected. I've been giving this talk at conferences for a couple of years now, and whenever I ask people in the testing world whether or not they're involved in analytics, the number is shockingly low. It's about 15%. And so that leads me to believe that the message still hasn't gotten out there that just how important it is to test the analytics API of your application. And I think it's just because, for the most part, these things tend to work fairly well. The problem is that there's a fair amount of risk that if they don't work fairly well, that things can go really, really badly. So what I'm going to do today is tell a story of how this has been a problem in the past, give us some examples specifically for you to look for, and talk about why it's important. And then I'll hand it over to Patrick to talk about how we can get started with testing APIs in general, and then move to the topic of monitoring APIs in production, because this all blends together in a topic of in the topic of really testing what your business cares about the most. Because as testers, I've found, at least in my career, that I've gotten many times carried away with things like testing one page in depth thoroughly so that I get all the edge cases and make sure that's 100% covered. And then one day I find out that none of our users actually care about any of those features, or they care about 1 or 2 of those features. And I can tell one real quick example where I had an outsourced QA company writing automation scripts for me, and their job was to provide coverage. Our directive was provide coverage of testing. So they wrote 800 test cases that covered the login and profile management piece of the retail software that I worked for. And then it turned out that the user analytics were telling us that only 1% of our users spent any time at all in those login and profile management pages. So we spent, by my calculation, over $1 million testing something that 1% of our users cared about. Meanwhile, we had about 30 cases covered the what we call the store page, that 99% of our traffic went to. So to me, studying user analytics and letting that feed into your test planning and your feature planning this means that you are testing the fundamentals of why your company is in business, and you're paying attention to the most important signals. And at the end of the story, I hope that you'll see how this can help to add a lot of relevance to the daily work of being in test, and how you're adding a huge amount of value and impact to your company's bottom line. So here it is, testing analytics. This is my horror story. So first of all, user analytics are simply signals that come from the journey that your user is taking through your software, and it applies to all platforms. You have user analytics coming from PlayStation, from Xbox, from mobile phones, right to the mobile APIs, and from websites, from everywhere. They're event-based. They tend to happen in key value pairs. So one event is going to include several different attributes about what's going on, and that'll be contained in key value pairs that usually you can parse and look at. And over time, over the course of a session, these user analytics will tell the story of how the user was interacting with your product as they moved through the system toward conversion or checkout, or however that went. And in my case, the story I'm going to tell, it was a custom analytics platform that we built. And but in a lot of cases, it's a Google Analytics or some Adobe Analytics. I think it's called Site Catalyst. that you use to embed into your software, and you use their engine to talk to the analytics API. Here's an example of what one looks like. It's simply an HTTP request that happens as a result of a click. If you see in the URL, I know it's kind of an eye chart, but my point in showing you is that these are really easy to overlook. If you open up the network tab, when you click around on a website using Google Inspect, Chrome Inspect, you'll see these requests coming in, and you can get to where you can filter for them. If you look for something like utm.gif, then you'll see there's a question mark, and then following normal URL protocols, there's key equals value, ampersand, key equals value, ampersand, key equals value. Now, these are all sorts of things that they're telling you, like screen resolutions, 1280 by 1024, that kind of thing. There's all sorts of attributes in here. And if you can see that you can start to put together a story of where did they come from, UTM source, UTM campaign. Campaign refers to a marketing campaign that somebody might put together, and that there's a really good chance that this link came from either an email or a deep link referral from some other place. The term of keywords, this is, keywords probably used in the search engine that drove you to this particular request or something like that. I'm not exactly sure what all of these mean, but the point is that at some point, all this is a collection of attributes. And it's the change in those attributes over the course of a user session that will tell the story. And the interesting thing to me is how little QA test people are involved in this part of the process, which is what I'm going to talk about right now. So at a very prominent e-commerce site that I used to work for, I'll try very hard not to say the name of it, even though I think it's probably okay. We would have this page that would list coupons. So each of these coupons, what it does is this company would make money when you go to this page, see a list of coupons, click the link on a coupon to go to the, in this case, Target web page. And then if you buy something, we dropped a cookie into your web browser session that would carry through to the checkout flow and would give us attribution, which means that we referred you to Target and we will get a small commission on the sale. That is how we made money. That's the source of all revenue. All revenue at this company, at least at the time, and now it's still probably 70% true, even though they've diverged into other things. But everything would come through click attribution, last attribution. So if we failed to drop the cookie, we failed to make money. We, in fact, gave Target a free sale and gave them a commissionless referral, which is bad for everyone involved, because then they don't know that we did it. We don't get the money. They get money they didn't deserve. The user then doesn't get to register that they found this great coupon on our site. And so all sorts of things go wrong if this cookie attribution doesn't happen. Now, here's the thing. Where you see the logo, that would drop a cookie. The link itself, $5 off $50 select items, that would drop a cookie. Get deal, that would drop a cookie. Any of those things that you can click there would create an analytic event that would say not only would drop the cookie, but also give us information about where you clicked and how soon you clicked it and how far down the page it was and how long you were on the page before you clicked it and whether or not you clicked something else before you clicked this. All of those things are signal. And the entire point of e-commerce and retail is to increase conversion, create conversion lift, as you call it, and enhance our ability to give you products and vouchers on products that you already want. That's the idea. And by measuring all these analytics and then doing tests within the within the product to find out if we created lift through things like changing the font size or changing the font color or changing the order of coupons, we would be able to compare the experiment, the A/B test, the experiment with the control, the normal operation of the site, to see, is this thing creating lift or not? And if the analytics are broken, or if they're even slightly off, we don't get the right signal. We're unable to make the right decisions. And that's where the horror story comes in. So try to follow this. B21 was the arbitrary name for coupon position, coupon index on the page. So B21, think of that as the key. B21, you might as well just think of it as saying coupon position. So every time you see B21 equals, that means coupon position was number 17. This was the 17th coupon down the page on the right, up to 30% off select men's fleece and sleepwear. The next one down was coupon number 18. B21 was coupon number 18 is men khaki shirt starting at $59.95. Now I should make this interactive and say, what should B21 equal for the next one, up to 40% off summer favorites, because it's the 19th coupon down the page. Should it be 19? There was a bug in our analytics which created a re-index of the coupons once a section break occurred. Unpopular coupons was inadvertently resetting the coupon index to 0, which means that when a user would click on this coupon, the analytics signal would go through and say, this person clicked on coupon 0 on the page, which gave the ranking algorithm the incorrect signal for where that coupon was placed on the page when it was clicked. And if we got that signal all day long, what would happen is, because of complicated stuff, this coupon would get promoted up the page and say it was in position 0 and it worked. Position 0, it worked. Position 0, it worked. It's getting that signal all day long. And eventually the resorting algorithm says, well, then obviously it needs to be at position 0 all the time. And so it caused two different problems. One is that it gave what turned out to be the 19th coupon down the page, which was an unpopular coupon, as you can see. It gave an unpopular coupon an unfair promotion to the top. It also caused a kind of a race condition with the coupon that was actually coupon 0 at the top of the page, which created some internal JavaScript errors, which resulted in a page load delay. So it made the page slow, and it promoted the wrong coupon to the top of the page. So I used to have a boss who said, after I wrote a really bad SQL query once, he said, not only is the query wrong, it's also very, very slow. That's what was happening here. It was slow and incorrect. Like, you can be one or the other. You should try not to be either. So this was back before we did A/B testing. We didn't do experiments. And the data loss that we experienced was irrecoverable. We had no accurate history of what was going on. And we lost $120,000 in 6 hours. And that was really just on one page. Like, we don't actually know how much money we lost. This is just what we know for certain we lost based on a comparison of historical data from the previous day. And this is all because analytics are software, but as 47 of 50 of the people watching this talk see, QA wasn't involved. We didn't test it. So analytics have historically not been included in test design, and that's the problem. So here's some other real-world examples. You see opportunities for this all the time. Marketing, its core function is to put the right product in front of the right person who will actually want it. It's not to throw a bunch of stuff at you and hope that you click on something. It's actually to try to target and make sure that you are the right audience for this thing, because it costs us money to put something in front of you that you don't want. So analytics are a way of honing the filter and the funnel to make sure that the right person is looking at the right thing at the right time. So analytics are used to calculate shopping cart stuff, shipping and tax calculations. They're used to suggest products and content based on cookie, not login. That means we can still help you see the right product at the right time, even if you don't have a login to the site. That's why if you go to Amazon multiple times, even if you never buy anything, it's going to try to start putting a story together. It'll also try to start putting a story together based on demographics, location. What have you looked for in the past? What have other people who buy things on this site looked for that you need to see in the past? And then I had someone ask at a conference recently that they were working on a toilet that actually connected to the internet. And they were asking, why does it need to connect to the internet? And my retail e-commerce brain immediately said, well, obviously it's analytics. They're trying to find out some stuff that I won't go into that you could probably imagine. But they're trying to figure out, how can they help? That's my uncynical view of it. So coordinating these things, trying to create lift, trying to hone the funnel and move you through the software faster. That's at least was always my goal. Because I assume if you're not working on a video game, that people don't actually want to use your software all day long. They want to have used your software along the path of getting something done. In the case of an e-commerce site, they want to move you through to the shopping cart phase. And we want to move it as fast as possible. Analytics help us with that. So every company here uses this for merchant affinity, category taxonomy, partnerships. We try to predict consumer behavior. And at least at the previous company I worked at, we tried to do this without being evil. So where does this fit in the software development lifecycle? Starts with marketing, because they have an idea of things they're trying to measure in order to create conversion lift. Then they talk to business intelligence. So at the very, very, very leftmost side of what's going on in the software project, talking to the very rightmost side of the software project, saying, someone at the very beginning saying, here's what we're trying to create as far as user behavior goes. What signals am I trying to measure? So they talk to the people in business intelligence, basically saying, what are you already measuring? How do I measure that? How do we predict whether or not we can create lift and measure that lift? Once they figure that out, they talk to the PM. That PM talks to the engineer. The engineer talks to the tester. The problem is that historically, what I've seen, in every case, it's the newest people on the team who are assigned to work on the analytics, because it is by far, in my experience, the least interesting thing to work on, because all it is a series of HTTP requests. So the newest engineer on the team and the tester, even if they're even involved at all, are the ones who are assigned to work on this piece. And I can't tell you how many times it was literally the last thing that was put in after most of the testing was done. And the problem is, it's software just like any other software you ever encounter. Software is software. Software always contains bugs. Analytics, therefore, can contain bugs. What if they're wrong? And what if it's ubiquitous? And what if the companies are more and more and more ascribing to this, but QA is being more and more and more left behind as it goes on? There's a whole team of people involved with this. It gets worked into features as they're developed. It's rarely called out separately in scheduled tasks. It's crammed in at the last minute. It rarely receives QA outside of project management and business intelligence. And I would love nothing more than if somebody in the audience can tell me that this is working differently at your company. But I haven't encountered very many companies that do understand this. I have encountered a few, just not very many. And it's usually only tested in general. Like they say, we're gonna test the search algorithm to see if it changes over time, but we're not going to test the actual requests that go on. So in my opinion, the thing you should do is not only test for the accuracy of the requests that are going to the API, which I think Patrick will have some examples of how to test the requests themselves that are going to the API, but also test whether or not the events are being emitted at all. Because one other example that I found at this e-commerce company that I worked for was that there were over 2,000 different combinations of ways that these analytics events could be emitted. And some of them just flat didn't emit the event. There was a JavaScript error that would cancel the request before it came through. And it wouldn't get sent at all, which means no tracking happens whatsoever, and we have no idea what the user did. And that's an easy test. Testing for accuracy of data, it's probably not. I don't want to over-index on the importance of that, because I found a $120,000 in 6-hour bug, but it is rare that the data is inaccurate. It is much more likely that the event just isn't being sent. But if you want to be relevant, this is the golden opportunity. This is how the CEO of the company I worked for learned my name. It's his favorite topic. It was his favorite topic. This is how you can deliver real value, because $1 million decisions are made with this data. Conversion lift is almost exclusively the domain of analytics and analytics testing. And it's just as buggy as any kind of other software. So it's one HTTP request made during a navigation event. You click on something, The request gets sent. You can examine that request. We usually do this using proxies. And I won't go deep into how we do that. There's a webinar online that you could find that I did a while back. If you Google my name plus analytics, in fact, you'll probably find quite a few things on it. So yeah, break down into key value pairs, build a map of expected results, and you look at what it should be. Sequence is 12? Yes. Category, correct category. Uh-oh, it wasn't a code, it was a sale. The more we got into it, the more we realized there were problems with the analytics themselves. So now at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Patrick to get a little bit more into the weeds and talk specifically about how these kinds of things can be tested. He's going to use slightly different examples, but I think it's going to be very relevant to what we've been talking about.
You know, it's funny. I actually had a similar scenario with a company I worked for. They had a partner API. The next afternoon, their partner reported back they hadn't made revenue in 24 hours. And it was neither tech team, it was the accounting team that recognized a lack of revenue. And then it ended up being an API release that wasn't catastrophic. It was something as small as just a semicolon in the wrong place. But their error handling exploded and just couldn't handle it. And so people couldn't actually check out and had lost an entire day's revenue. And it was like one of our largest partner API customers as well. So it's real problematic for us. And that's honestly what the story, the thing that got me to start API Fortress. But what I can speak to now is really the stuff that I've been doing. Like I've been in the API space with API Fortress alone for 5 years. Before that, I was a sales engineer at Getty Images and UsableNet, and Venda was like an e-commerce platform I worked at for a while. There's just a bunch of things we've noticed along the way that led to my co-founder and I building API Fortress. And what we noticed, and the thing that we really like stuck in on, was the APIs, you might be testing them on release, but once they're in production, they seem to be just left on their own, as if once something's built, it's good. It's like saying like you've built the car, but once you've built the car, you don't have to do a yearly inspection. The reality is that's not true. As soon as you release it to production, it has to be tested again functionally, because that's an entirely different data set. So really what I want to hook into here is just this concept of like different teams have different goals, and that could be a problem because sometimes one team is given a task that they're not quite suited for, while the other team should be given a little more capability to help with that task or to run it themselves. So just one quick example that happened with us with one of our customers was that we had this there's a book company, and they had an API that fed you all of their ISBNs, which is basically the product IDs of the books. And so all of their ISBNs are getting fed and sent every day whenever you want, and through this API, you could just call it actively. And they realized they really built the API for themselves, but also for about 13 partners. And every couple of weeks, they would get a bunch of partner like emergency emails saying like, hey, a bunch of these products aren't working. And so they would obviously like log in, look at the API, look at some ISBNs, run it and see like, oh, this works. Like, I don't understand what's happening. Long story short, what we did is we created a test that made the first call of asking for that entire list, every single ISBN. In that same test, we then would randomly take 500 to 1,000 of those ISBNs and dive into them individually and pull up their like product detail stuff. And that's when we started noticing hundreds of issues. Long story short, what was happening was that because their API manager was caching the API, every 2 weeks they'd update the database, but until that cache was getting reset, which only happened like maybe every 6 hours, they would have hours of a bunch of bad and out-of-print books being listed in their big API with all the products, but that didn't actually exist because that big API was listing, which is what were now old products. And that's to say that this was simply caching that wasn't refreshed when a database is being updated. I didn't say a single word that is API, but the only way you catch that is by creating a smart API test. And that's the big difference. And that's why like we're at Sauce Labs now, because visual and all that stuff is only a part of the story. And API, especially these days with all these companies like MuleSoft and Masher getting bigger and bigger, they really are becoming the foundation of platforms and like, mobile apps especially. And then there's just partner APIs as well. So the thing that we always try to push upon our customers is you should be recreating, because this is now more possible than ever before, is the entire consumer flow in one test, but at an API level. Because everyone's doing this, well, hopefully everyone's doing this on like the visual level, but underneath it, there are APIs, and it's very likely you can do this whole story at the API level these days, especially if you're doing like mobile app testing. A lot of that stuff is just APIs. So running that whole flow, making sure it interconnects, is just foundational to how to really have a successful test and make sure your APIs are and your platforms aren't just up, but they're actually running correctly. And like, as Marcus talked about, and as I was talking about with the Shop in BC and with the other one, everything was actually working, but fundamentally we were losing a lot of money because we just didn't do quite the right thing. And so again, this just goes into a little more detail of what I'm saying, but like APIs really are becoming sort of the currency of how platforms are built. Like it's starting at the API level, and then you build things on top of those APIs. And more than that, and something that it's on apifortress.com, we have a blog and we talk about a lot of this stuff in detail. Everyone's always talking about security and data breaches. If you actually look into the vast majority of data breaches, and actually there's statistics on this stuff, it's like over 90% are human error or functional errors. People think that there's all this hacking going on. It seems like it's a cool title, but it's usually just, so if we just look at like these three, very broadly, Twitter's error was that they created an endpoint that could be abused and didn't have rate limiting. India had an API that was public that shouldn't have been public. And the United States Postal Service didn't check to see what happens if you search by wildcard. Like if you search by a specific number, you get a specific return. But if you search by a wildcard, you shouldn't be receiving everyone's information. But that's what would happen on the United States Postal Service site. So those are the sort of things that like I like to convey is everyone wants to always spend money and talk about security testing. The beginning and the vast majority of security testing is just looking out for human error and functional errors. Like not testing what a search result will look like off a wildcard should be a test you do. You should be like, if it's a search test, you should be searching by weird stuff and everything you can imagine to see what happens, like positive and negative. So all of these APIs and all of these issues are, they're happening. It's fact. They're just going out there. And so one thing that's been really interesting over the last 5 years, and with us talking, we have lots of customers and users, and we've been trying to get a better understanding of specifically where the gap is happening, what the specific issues that are going on. And so there's a lot of different theories and a lot of things around it. But to us, we've really sort of honed it into something specific as much as possible and where we think there's a gap. And for us, there's a difference between uptime and functional uptime. That's the very first one. And then it's who actually owns that. So just saying something's up. So some people are creating API tests and they just do a ping 200. And if it responds, it's up. But as I said, with that partner API where they make revenue for 24 hours, that passed the ping test because we did have ping tests up. But functionally, there was an error in it that only affected a handful of our partners. But for one of them, it was cataclysmic because we weren't running functional tests barely at all, and especially not once it went live. They'd do it just before live and then push it live and sort of get away from it and walk away. So for us, it's this big thing of like, who actually owns this though? Like what department's in charge of it? And to us, that's where the crux of the issue is for many large organizations. Obviously, there's exceptions everywhere, but what I'm speaking to here is from my experience, it's the 80-20 rule. 80% of the companies we deal with are suffering from this, which is, all right, we got to make sure our production stuff is working, and that's using monitoring tools. And so they get, the Datadog is probably the biggest one here, although New Relic and AppDynamics. New Relic, AppDynamics, Datadog, those are pretty much the top three here, but these other ones are pretty big as well. So these are the tools people are using today, and they're using it to quote-unquote monitor. But there's a big issue with these tools specifically, and I know it was my whole job to build a platform that was better than these things. So like I would just figure out like, all right, these guys are doing API stuff now, like they're adding new features. Oh, we do API testing. And so you really look into it, and you start seeing that there's where the issues lie. First, they didn't all have it initially, but then it really goes into this. Like if you actually look at like AppDynamics, New Relic, Datadog, you really dive into what they're doing for API, they're using the word synthetic testing, and that's the first thing to look out for. Because if they say that word, that means it's a ping test. It's real life. You're not really testing the functionality of it. You're just saying, oh, it's there. And that's a problem. Like with the book reseller example I was speaking to, we needed to do a proper multi-step functional test, which is a non-starter in the monitoring platforms that are viewed today as the most important monitoring platforms. The other thing is it's siloed. So most organizations don't have QAs in the monitoring team. It's a monitoring team and they run on their own. That's a totally different team with a totally different understanding and a totally different set of goals. And those goals don't go into creating multi-step functional tests for APIs sometimes. The other issue is just they're using a different platform. So no one here is using Datadog to functionally test their APIs as part of their CI. It's not an option. It's not what it does. But why is that it then used to monitor the functionality of the API in production? Why are we moving to a completely different platform for something that's almost the exact same job? If you want to test on release, you could also just make that test run constantly, and it's a quote unquote monitor. It seems silly, but it's as basic as that. We just don't see that at over 80% of the companies that we deal with. And again, this is more speaking to bullet 4 here speaks to the first bullet, which is platforms aren't made for that. And even when you're trying to like write something that's API functional testy, it's real basic, and it's not enough. If you want to do search, add to cart, checkout in one test, try to do that in those major monitoring platforms today, and you'll see where the constraints are. It's not only a completely different platform, it's just not giving you those capabilities. So just from a high, again, just putting it all together in a nutshell here, but ultimately, like, you have a team of experienced QAs, and many of the people on this call probably are that team. You have experienced QAs, but then you also have a monitoring team. Is there an overlap there? Are they using similar tools? Are they using similar tests? The QA team, the testing team, the engineers, they're all together knowing how the API should actually function. Does the monitoring team know exactly how it's supposed to function and how they're supposed to work together and integrate and do a whole like end-to-end test? That's where the issue lies in 80% of the companies like we've talked to and where we think this happens. Again, there are exceptions, and hopefully your organization is an exception, but the majority of the time, the team in charge of Datadog is a totally different team that's in charge of testing on staging. Yet somehow it's the exact same thing once delivered that's not being tested in the same way any longer. And that's just foundationally a huge issue that we've specifically been hooking into over all this time. So for us, just the biggest thing we always speak to is you are the experts at the thing you're testing. So like if you're in charge of creating smart tests and smart analytics and smart things for APIs, why are you taken out of that conversation when it goes to production? Doesn't happen all the time, but the vast majority of the time, that's what we're seeing. Functional monitoring is the actual monitoring you should be doing, way more than just a ping test or just a synthetic monitor as the verbiage they use. It has to be more than that, because the book publisher had monitoring. They were using one of the icons I had there. They didn't catch it. They had no idea. So again, reasons for doing this, because at the end of the day, I'm trying to do is cheerlead having QA teams with more responsibility, because there is a gap happening, and the quickest and most pragmatic way to fix that gap in our experience is to just have the QA teams get involved in this stuff. And so for us, it's about just reducing those risks, because the QA teams, even the engineers, if you're an organization that the engineers write their own tests, then they should be in charge of this stuff too, because they know what it should do and how it should be tested. And yeah, I mean, all this stuff is pretty easy. and I'm not going to just read it to you, but like this is it. Like it goes to the point of these are security breach type things. It's functional, it's human, it's just bugs 95% of the time. Test it properly. Don't just hope once you hand something off, they're going to just absolutely do a great job at functionally testing it, because very often they're starting from scratch in something that's completely different. They can't like copy and paste your tests into their platform if you're not using the same thing throughout. And to us, like that's the way we built the platform. We built this specifically to be used throughout all the way through production for this reason, because my co-founder and I, just before we left, had seen a catastrophic issue of this sort because this was lacking. And that's what got us started on this. And we started interviewing potential customers, and we realized there was a thing there. And then we just went down the path, and we ended up being right. And again, this goes into, obviously today, a lot of budgets are being cut and things like that. But something to be mindful of is we're not talking about adding new platforms. We're talking about having what you're using today work more efficiently, using your existing QA headcounts more effectively and in a more broad range, or at the very least to be advisors to the monitoring team if that's how it needs to work. But whatever it is, like you should be functionally testing your APIs in production, and it won't have a cataclysmic effect to your analytics, because we're not saying every 30 seconds. We're saying once every 5 minutes, once every 10 minutes even. We prefer 5, we prefer 1, but like if you're an organization with a really popular website, having it hit it every 5 minutes once doesn't affect anything, but it gives you the eyes on the potential like huge issues. So I assume like a lot of this stuff is going to be shared later on. So I just write some high level pointers, and I'm sure there's more. We have more stuff on our website, API Fortress, but just from high level, an API is data. So think of proofreading that API. That's how I think of it. It's not just the objects, but it's the data associated. So the test should be more than just, does it have a price? You can actually set up tests whereby it says like, oh, if it's a pair of socks, the price should never be over $25. That sort of detail is what gets you away from having the issue of, we've all seen those flights that end up being $1. And for a minute, everyone's buying that flight before they fix it. Why is there not a monitor making sure there's never a flight that's below $150 or whatever the price might be? Like that shouldn't even been allowed. It should have been caught within the first 5 minutes themselves. Just some of the basic best practices. This seems dumb, but I have to reiterate it because of how rarely we see it perfectly executed. Just testing everything, including the data, not just the objects, and using your functional tests in production. Schedule them to run in production against production, and you're going to be in a great place. We actually have a lot of customers now that are using our monitoring features in staging. So like, as I said, APIs are running everything. So their entire platform depends on these internal APIs that have to be up. So while the customers themselves might not be hitting the APIs, what the customers are hitting runs on these APIs. So that internal monitoring is just as important as like testing a partner API, for example. Then the more advanced stuff, variabilizing is really useful. Try not to hard code too much. This is really important if you're trying to like hit it against different staging environments or just in different ways. Business logic, that's what I was speaking to when I made the example of like the socks or the airline that should be over $1. We call that like business logic testing. There's some basic logic that can be added to any test to make it smarter and smarter, and just continual refinement and iteration. Dynamic data is one of the biggest ones. So everyone has like a spreadsheet, but they should be going beyond the spreadsheet. Like this is the thing that gets dropped between testing, staging, and production. Production has a totally different set of data. Sometimes the data is actually entered by your customers, and they might be entering it in a way that isn't expected. We have a whole case study about that around Etsy, whereby like customers were entering things in a way that wasn't perfect, and it was causing them to lose tens of thousands of dollars because products weren't able to be found and they weren't listed in their core navigation. And it wasn't an API issue. It was actually the team in charge of where you enter your product, the web page where you enter your product, put the images there, make a price and post it. That that web page team, the team that made that one page, had just made one small error, but it was costing them tens of thousands of dollars potentially every day. And again, that just goes into the siloing of things. Like people built the API, they said, here's how the API should work. If you don't have the exact same people working on that stuff, you can lead to these issues, which is fine because you can't have the same people working on everything, but you can create tests that can capture hopefully the majority of when things fall through the cracks and aren't going as expected. Integration testing, end-to-end testing, again, this to me, like this means just reproducing consumer flow, search, add to cart, checkout, whole thing at an API level in one test, positive and negative testing against it, all that stuff. It takes time, but you don't have to have it all working day one. Just get to it eventually, and you're in a great place. And then this really goes into, this is my final bullet of the presentation. It goes into what Marcus started with, confirming like what you're asking for is what you receive. That is a really big thing, but it's really possible with API tests that if you make a call, you can then have that, if it's the same test, the response, you can say like, well, actually, is it actually giving me what I just asked for? And that comes into variabilizing and doing things like that. We have a bunch of examples on that stuff that we could show later, but that's it for me. I guess now is if there's any questions that have come up from Marcus or myself. I haven't really been looking at those right now.
There have been a few questions that came in through the chat, so we're going to dive into those. Feel free to add more questions to the chat. We have 10-15 minutes for this as needed. So Patrick, just to get us started with questions, for anybody who's not doing API testing today, do you have any recommendations for how to get started?
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of good platforms out there. I mean, we have a free trial, obviously, but even at just like an even more basic level, Postman, just you download Postman, you try it, and Postman will show you like the facilities, and there's a lot of stuff out there how to make an API test. So Postman's a good starting point as to like understanding the nuances of making an API test, getting a response, looking at all that stuff. When it comes to testing, that's when you need to go beyond Postman and you start looking at the other platforms out there. But to us, like just simply as simple as downloading Postman and looking at some of their like learn more about what an API is guides has been really beneficial. And then once you learn the basics, you're ready to go to the next stage, which is creating a testing system around it.
Great. And on one of your slides, you showed some different tools that are available for monitoring. And one participant here was wondering why Splunk wasn't on that list, and if you have any thoughts on Splunk for monitoring.
No, I don't have any specific thoughts. I just put a list of logos together. I haven't looked at Splunk in a while, so they may be in a better place now than they once were specific to API monitoring. But I can't speak to them right now.
Great. And so in terms of a couple of best practice questions, and these are for both Patrick and Marcus, do you have, the question here is, how do you test multiple steps of a transaction with API testing?
How do you test multiple steps of a transaction with API testing?
So for example, and just to clarify that, like for example, like there could be a checkout flow, and then without logging in, adding to your cart, or you have to point it somewhere to the checkout. There's a bunch of steps in some of these scenarios. Yeah.
I mean, it's not the easiest thing in the world, but it actually is much easier if you choose the right platform. So like ourselves and probably, Smart Bears products and Parasoft. Yeah, those are pretty much the three like larger ones. We have facilities specific to this sort of thing. I mean, we think the way we do it is better than the others, obviously, but the reality is like if you choose one of the three major API testing platforms out there, because we do want to remain agnostic here, they do have facilities to make that easier. The biggest thing is this is one of the major constraints of Postman and why I really want to caution people against committing to testing in Postman. You make a Postman call and then there's a tab and it attaches a test to it. What you really want is a workbench where you make multiple calls in a single test with dynamic responses. You don't want a test connected to a single call. You want to be able to make 5 calls in one test and it's not even going linearly. It could jump around. So if it returns a 200, it goes here. Returns a 401, it returns over there. And then that starts moving on to a different flow with some like if valuations. There's a lot to be said around having that sort of dynamic capabilities within the test, and it comes down to just making sure you choose the right platform. So it's either building it in-house or choosing one of the three that I mentioned previously. And there's probably a couple others I'm forgetting, but like those are really the three big ones I know of.
Yeah, my experience was with Rest Assured primarily, but with Rest Assured it's difficult because you have to figure out what information you have to store and persist from one call to the next. So that made it challenging, but not impossible.
Yeah, and Rest Assured is a little more programmatic than some companies want to do, but Rest Assured is definitely, I would say, the most popular, I would say, for API testing in terms of like a basic, in terms of a framework.
Yeah, you don't typically have to code up your own HTTP request. Like it generally understands what's going on, but yeah, it's
We got another one that just came in that says, how do you test when you go to PayPal, Google Pay, Apple Pay at checkout?
We also have on GitHub, we built this thing called 3LOA, so 3-leg OAuth, and we have some other stuff too. And we're actually going to be rebuilding this, but it's open source. And it's specifically around that, around allowing you to create this process by which to go to another thing and come back. And so what you're speaking to, Google Pay is one of them. The other one's like Facebook login and stuff like that. These things were specifically built to not be automated. That's it. They were specifically built not to be automated. We figured out a way where it's possible. So we're not saying you should, because it's usually against the TOS, but we do have a thing on GitHub under API Fortress called 3-leg OAuth, 3LOA, if you want to take a look at it. There's a lot of stuff you can do that's interesting out there around these. But again, the easiest, the straightforward one is mocking, as Marcus was suggesting.
Yeah. I mean, I guess to clarify on that, I think the question was, how do you test Google Pay, Apple Pay? And I would recommend against testing Google Pay, Apple Pay. They are platforms that somebody else writes. You have no responsibility of them, no ability to control them, no understanding of the inner workings or anything. All you know about is the contract. My advice is to just test to make sure that the request is sent and that whatever you're asking returns a result that is understandable to be an approximation of what those APIs would send back to you. But if you get to the point where you're saying you have a test case which exclusively says test API with Google Pay with this request, test it with this request, then you're testing somebody else's API, and I would recommend against that.
I will say we did have one customer that was using us specifically to monitor third-party payment processors, but it was something, as you said, it was much less functional and much more like a high level, green light or red light, and because for them, they were one of the top 3 retailers. So for them, like even a performance degradation was significant. And so your monitor also flagging for when performance exceeds 150 milliseconds or whatever the number you want.
Yeah.
And it notifying you. That alone that could save you a lot of headaches, just performance-wise monitoring for it, which is something we can do, and I assume that other platforms can do it as well. I think maybe even Datadog can do that.
Yeah, I mean, imagine the difference in user experience when you go to a page and it basically just says something like Google Pay unavailable right now, as opposed to clicking a button and waiting 40 seconds and having it come back with a stack trace or some sort of horrible error message. We don't know what happened.
Yeah.
If you had a monitor basically telling you, oh, is Google good right now? All right, cool. Then let this go through.
Yeah. So for them, it was absolutely critical. Like they're a top 3 retailer, so they needed everything running quickly.
Yeah.
And they needed to be in a privileged position. Otherwise, it was catastrophic to a scale of millions per hour minimum.
Yeah.
Another question came in here around prioritization. And, this really calls back to the first presentation too. How can you use analytics or figure out how to prioritize tests? Like, should you be looking at the most visited, most used pages, or how do you pick out, what you're going to test?
It's interesting. I partnered with the people in business intelligence, BI, we called it, back there. We had a lot of inbuilt stuff. And I think, honestly, if I had to do over again, we would have bought somebody else's solution. But we built our data lake to tell us this kind of stuff. And there was as one example of one thing that someone did, a data scientist wrote a script. I don't even think it took him half a day, that told us to the penny how much commission we had made on every version of every browser, every platform over the last 30 days. So we could say, it is really a pain to keep supporting Internet Explorer version 10 on Windows 7. Should we continue to support it? And we would have this report that said, we made $4.22 on Internet Explorer 10 on Windows 7 last month. Do not support it anymore. So we would have that kind of report to feed us that kind of intelligence, to tell us, basically, there's a threshold at which you no longer should care, and you should try to drive the user's behavior, as opposed to bending over backwards and trying to kill yourself to support $4 of revenue.
We had something similar where I worked at an e-commerce platform, and so they spent 3 weeks for every new website they were building, testing the marketing emails. The vast majority of the testing was against an old Outlook, downloadable old Outlook. But this was a retailer. Most people are getting that to their personal webmails, and they weren't testing webmail at all. So it was as simple as I literally told them we need to rewrite all of this. None of this. People shouldn't be getting Outlook email. There is very little Outlook to personal purchases from jeans. And if you're not even testing Gmail or Hotmail or Yahoo or AOL, you're missing a huge majority of where it's going.
My opinion on that was, when we were doing that at retail, and I actually ran the e-marketing at one point, and the team, and I had an idea for, because 90% of the problems you see in an email like that is that the deep link that you put in the email doesn't get you all the way to the end. 90% of the problems just came down to that. And I thought, well, couldn't we just send an email to a particular address that would just parse the email and look through it? There's still some look and feel issues that could be a problem, but just a simple link tester or something like that.
Yeah, the one thing I've learned always is question why you're doing something.
Yeah.
You could be spinning your wheels on a really dumb idea that someone came up with a long time ago. And that's a huge issue I see all the time. It's your first day or your 1,000th day. Just sit down and really think, wait, why am I doing this? Because you realize that there's a lot of shrugging and other people thinking, well, it's just because someone else had been doing it. The reality is, if you just listen to the Freakonomics podcast, that's all they talk about is people doing the same stupid thing. Then when they actually look at the map, they realize, oh, wow, we are not doing the right thing at all.
Yeah, 800 tests to test the login and profile.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody cared. Literally nobody cared about half of those tests.
Yeah, and the other thing too is you start building tests and somebody else builds another test. At what point do you delete the test?
Yeah.
You don't need 8,000 tests necessarily, and you're spending a long time waiting for those all to execute, especially we're talking UI, UX. One test running against 10 different versions of something. That's 10 tests. So it explodes numerically.
Yeah, I think it's really funny that we are a test execution platform who makes our money on test execution, telling you definitively, please start deleting your tests, because we're not. We're here to help make these programs successful, not just spin your wheels on stuff that's useless. So please delete tests.
Do yourselves a favor.
Yeah, and kind of a follow-up question from the audience here is whether you have any recommendations for test analytics tools.
So the process I followed was I would use a proxy called BrowserMob, but there's a number of proxies out there. And essentially I would manually break apart the URL and examine it programmatically. So I could do this hundreds of times per minute. Postman is a very manual tool and wouldn't work. Now, if you're trying to test one-offs here and there, I think Postman is okay for that, but it just really depends on what you're trying to do. But there is a tool. If your company is using Site Catalyst, Adobe's analytics tools, there's a tool that I should type in here. If you Google Web Analytics Automated Testing, there's a program called WAT on GitHub that is written by a really good friend of mine, Anand Bagmar. In fact, I'll type his name in here as well. If you Google those two things together, you'll find an open source tool that he worked that I collaborated with him on that will help you be able to test the requests and their correctness from Adobe.